June 15th is her script surgery. It's actually June 28th. So please mark that day. And also Kim Nickel will be going to UVA on June 15th. Mom and Maggie's sister Geraldine is at home and is doing well. And we thank everyone for the prayers for her. And also Debbie told us this morning that Elmer is back in the hospital and will be there a couple of days. So keep Elmer very in your prayers. We have a thank you note from Caroline Stacy. East Bristol Church family, I want to express my gratitude for how much you all have shown me. I have felt nothing but Christian love and friendliness from the church ever since I was a little girl coming here. All of your support, well wishes, and prayers really made a large impact on my life. Thank you so much for my graduation journal gift and for the most beautiful, warm bridal shower a young lady could ask for. Thank you for always welcoming me home and with open arms. My schooling taught me the skills for nursing, but growing here at East Bristol has given me kindness and compassion that will be with me for years, no matter where I go. In Christian love, Caroline Stacy. So I'll post this on the board, and it's good to have Caroline and the family with us. Today's singing at 5 o'clock is canceled. Also keep in mind our meeting coming up June 16th through the 21st. We have a whole group coming in from Alabama. Mark Howell will be speaking those dates. And with the food assignments, they will be coming out in the next few days. Keep in mind, we're going to be feeding 70 plus people each evening, so we're going to need quite a bit of food. And Betty and Tim are working on those assignments, so just keep that in mind. Make sure I don't forget any announcements this morning. Our assignments this morning, Ronnie will be having our scripture and opening prayer. Tim will be having our closing prayer. And Brother Floyd will be bringing the lesson this morning, the importance of the Old Testament. Now, if you get your songbook and turn to 833. 833. Good morning. Good morning. Let's see everybody out. Let's all sing. There's a message true and glad for the single and the sad. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. It will give them courage too. It will help them to be true. Bring it on, bring it on, bring out the word for land. Till far from
scriptures, we might have hope. Romans 15, hope. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we're so thankful that we can come together as our people to study our word, sing songs of praises to thee. Thankful for all the many blessings that we have, that we enjoy each day from thy hand. Most of all, we are so thankful for the gift of our only begotten Son, through his death on the cross, his resurrection, that we might also have faith, and we might be thy children through obedience to his will. This morning we pray for those that are mentioned sick, those that are recovering from illnesses, those that will be having surgeries and so forth in the future. We pray that all these might work for their good. Pray that you be with us each day and help us to do thy will. In Jesus' name, amen.
As we prepare to take the Lord's Supper, we'll turn to 408. Low in the grave delay. We'll sing the chorus only after the third verse.
gracious Father, we thank you for this food. Pray, Heavenly Father, that our minds and our hearts will be set on the cross of God, sacrifice, God, that you made for all those others so much. In Jesus' name, we pray.
We're prepared to do as we've been prospered. We would turn to 511, and we'll sing the first verse of 511. All we come together, all three sing and pray. Here we bring our offering on this holy day. Help us, Lord, thy love to sing. May we all in truth and spirit worship thee.
Take that part of the Lord's Supper, any time you can talk. Please back. Your Lord, work in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Lord, thank you so much for all of your blessings you've given us. Lord, thank you for our strengths and our abilities that we have. As we get back to the cross, we say that your Son is your Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
call sweetly rings over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above. While the light from the throne shines for you and me, let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call of love. On the road to the goal, birds we must serve, but we have help from realms above. We receive courage to when we kneel in prayer. Let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call of love. While we tarry below, there is work to do, and our strength cometh from above. As we labor and wait, we must hold be true. Let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call of love. Amen. Good to be together. Good to see your smiling faces and be a part of the worship together this morning. Yes, we have plenty of folks who are on vacation, and we hope they have a safe trip. And but for you who are here, we're glad you're here. And if you're visiting with us, we're very thankful that you've taken the opportunity to be a part of our worship this morning. The importance of the Old Testament. It's a thought that's been running through my mind, and it's something that I wanted us to sort of look at this morning. Because so much of our knowledge from our childhood comes from the Old Testament. You know, we think about some of the wonderful stories about how God gave the children of Israel passage through the Red Sea. And then you think about how God calls manna to fall down from heaven and feed them in the wilderness. Then we think about stories that are even more interesting, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the wonderful story of how God protected them from the fiery furnace. You think about the story of Daniel and the lion's den, how God shut the mouth of the lion. We teach these stories to our children. Jonah and the great fish. Who can forget that one? It's stories that we know, and they're things that we think about, but so often they are completely removed from who we are as a Christian, and we don't even think about the fact that the Old Testament is there with a purpose, and that its purpose is to help solidify who we are and what we believe. Sometimes we think that the Old Testament is just fodder for children. But the reality is that it's there for a very specific purpose, and in fact, it's a very important purpose. Brother Ronnie read to us a few moments ago from Romans 15 and verse 4. The things that were written aforetime are written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Have you ever stopped to consider the truth that everything in the Old Testament is written with a purpose of helping us to find the patience and the comfort of knowing who God is? that God cares for His own people, and ultimately we would not really have an understanding of the concept of grace if it were not for the Old Testament. How would we understand the concept of grace if the Bible just simply says God is a gracious God? Now surely it is culminated in the cross, and I understand that. But we need more than just a point in time for us to realize that God didn't just all of a sudden become gracious to send His Son to die on the cross. What we need to understand is that God has always been gracious from the very beginning. In fact, He was very gracious in the garden. His care for Adam and Eve and the struggle that they faced as they stood against and fell to the temptation of Satan in the garden is a tragic story, were it not for the fact that God demonstrated there in that garden that He was going to bring forth grace by which He would save mankind through the seed of woman. That God had a plan, even in the sense that man, who was created with the ability to choose, made the wrong choice. Sometimes we struggle with that. Why did God give man the right to choose? And then, when man chose, punishment came. It's to teach us the very nature of failure to make the right choices. You know, we live in a world that struggles with the concept of making right and wrong choices. Everybody wants my choices to always be right. What I choose is right because I chose it. Even in our school systems these days, we're struggling a little bit with enforcing the importance of certain rudimentary learning processes, such as spelling and writing. Things that used to be considered to be important are less important today. And I don't mean to take those things and elevate them to the status of our eternal salvation, because truthfully, they shouldn't be elevated to the status of our eternal salvation. A person's ability to spell or inability to spell is irrelevant in the eyes of God. But the fact is that we see it as a conceptual change in our society that says that we want people to be able to make their own choices without regard to the consequences that they press onto others. That's a philosophy that's very dangerous. And the Old Testament helps us to understand that concept from the very beginning, that God created us with the ability to choose and with the ability to make choices. And yet, we should realize that when we make choices, they have consequences that affect other people. If we make the wrong choice, then that consequence passes down to other people, and they struggle in the same consequence. But God, who is greater than all, had a plan to save man. Even though man grew increasingly sinful in the Old Testament, the Bible tells us about in Genesis how that every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, and it grieved God that He made man upon the face of the earth, and so He determined that He would destroy man, whom He had created from off the face of the earth. We struggle, why would God make that decision? And yet we ourselves find ourselves in the same place in our own lives sometimes with our frustration about things that we do not believe should be as they are. God faced a crisis in His own creation, and He made the determination that it was better to eliminate man from off the face of the earth. I don't know what God would have done had that been the final judgment. But what God's final judgment was, is that He found grace to offer to Noah and to his family. And this is the whole reason that we're even able to read about the story. You ever stop and consider the fact that if God had followed through with every thought of man's heart is only evil continually, I will destroy man from off the face of the planet, that we wouldn't be able to read that, and thus it would not exist, because there would have been no one after that. But the fact is that we have it so that we can see that God was searching diligently and willing to save his creation. We don't think of it like this sometimes. Sometimes we think of, oh, all of the people who died in the flood. Did you ever stop and consider the ones that lived? Did we ever stop to consider that God cared enough to save the planet for 8 souls? That he said, I care enough about you 8 people that I'll save the whole planet for you. That's the grace of God. The fact of the matter is that God's grace has never been different. His desire to save mankind has never been different. And in our world today, we struggle to contemplate or even understand how much God cares for us. And it's so oftentimes the fact that we have just taken the Old Testament and relegated it to story time, instead of really looking at it from critical eyes to understand what was God doing and why did he reveal this to us. Why do we need to know about this event in history? One thing that's amazing to me that I think is important to note is that in the New Testament there are 855 estimated, and that may be shy because they didn't necessarily give all of the possible quotes, but there's 855 Old Testament quotes in the New Testament. You ever stop to consider how important the Old Testament is to the New Testament? The Bible teaches us that the Old Testament is there for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope, and yet over and over and over again in the New Testament, they quote the Old Testament. In fact, they teach from the Old Testament. All of the sermons in the book of Acts, do you know what their text is? The Old Testament. Why? Because it's the Old Testament that demonstrates the very nature of God and the willingness of God to save mankind. God wants to save mankind. Turn with me, if you would, to Acts, the 2nd chapter. And I want you to just notice something. We're not going to read through Acts chapter 2. We're not going to read through the sermon that Peter preached. But this is the very first sermon on the day of Pentecost. And it says that Peter lifted up his voice with the 11 and said unto them, Ye men of Judea, all ye that dwell in Jerusalem, be this known unto you, and hearken to my words. These men are not drunken, as you suppose, seeing it is but the 3rd hour of the day, but this is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel. And so he gives his text from Joel chapter 2. And then he goes on through this very short sermon, very short lesson, to teach them about Joel chapter 2 and the event that was transpiring, Psalm chapter 16 relative to the crucifixion of Christ, and Psalm 110 that Christ has been raised and is reigning on the right hand of God. He gives 3 basic points in that sermon. 3 things drawn from the Old Testament to demonstrate this is the will of God. And it's proven historically. It's proven through the writings that you are all well aware of. And then it says that by that sermon, they were pricked in their hearts. And they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. A whole sermon based on 3 Old Testament passages. Then turn over a couple of pages, and when you come to Acts the 7th chapter, I want you to stop. And I want you to notice that this is where Stephen is standing in defense of the accusations that are made against him. They said of him that he was a man who ceased not to speak blasphemous words against the holy place and against the law. And he says, We've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered to us. And all the people that sat in the council looked steadfastly on him, and they saw his face as it had been the face of an angel. And so in chapter 7, Stephen is asked the question of the high priest, Are these things so? And then he began his speech to them. And again, I'm not going to read to you the speech, but if you have some time, I want you to notice what his speech is about. He starts off with Genesis chapter 11. He described everything that transpires in chapter 11, chapter 12. Then he moves to Exodus chapter 3. Then he comes back to Genesis 17. Then he begins in Genesis chapter 37 and continues to describe everything through Genesis 41. Then 47. Then 49. He continues to goes back to Exodus and finishes out the book. Basically, he gives them a full historical document of everything that transpired in the Old Testament relative to the children of Israel, starting off at the promise of God that he was going to bless all nations of the earth through Abraham. And every event that transpired, Stephen touches on. So many of the Old Testament miracles, Stephen touches on. And he gives credibility to them. And he states them as if they're absolute accepted known fact. And then when he concludes with his sermon, he asks them this question in verse 51. Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you do always resist the Holy Ghost. As your fathers did, so do ye. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? They have slain them which showed before on the coming of the just one, of whom have ye been now the betrayers and the murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart. And they gnashed on him with their teeth, and being full of the Holy Ghost, he looked up steadfastly into heaven, and he saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and he said, Behold, I see the heavens open, and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. And they cried out with a loud voice, and they stopped their ears, and they ran upon him with one accord, and they cast him out of the city, and they stoned him. The witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul. And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And he kneeled down and he cried with a loud voice, laying on this sin to their charge, Lord. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. A very simple sermon of Old Testament history. It made the people so mad they didn't like it. They killed him. Simply giving them a history lesson. And pointing out the fact that their own history they did not know. I wonder sometimes if we knew our history, what our reaction would be. If we really understood the history of the church and how the church came to be through the grace of God in the Old Testament. Would our reaction be like those of Acts chapter 2, to be pricked in our hearts and motivated to want to obey it? Or would our hearts be cut within us to the point of anger? We would want to reject it and turn away from it and say, I don't want to worship a God like that. And then cast out the one who delivers the message. The Old Testament is important to us because it lays down a foundation for everything we know and everything we understand. And it's frustrating to me that we live in a world that basically wants to relegate the Old Testament to ancient documents that don't have significance to us in the New Testament age. It has all the significance in the world. We don't know who God is without the Old Testament. We do not fully understand His grace without the Old Testament. We do not understand the nature of sin and how God sees it without the Old Testament. And we do not understand the process by which God redeems and saves man if it is not given to us by the Old Testament. It is the Old Testament quotes that are used throughout the New Testament, 855 of them, that help us to understand how much God loves us, cares for us, and provides for us. So what that should do is it should motivate us to want to know more about the Old Testament, to study it more. There's also another simple fact that I would like to bring to our attention, and that is revealed to us in Luke, the 16th chapter. If you'll turn over there, Luke chapter 16. And you'll recognize this right off the bat as soon as you get there. This is the parable which Jesus told, or the story, as I see it's an example coming straight from the mouth of our Lord about the rich man and the beggar whose name was Lazarus. And of course you remember the story that the rich man was clothed in purple and fine linen, and he fared sumptuously every day, but there was a beggar whose name was Lazarus, who was laid at his gate. And Lazarus was miserable in that he was filled with sores. And he desired to be fed with crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. And the dogs came and licked his sores. What Jesus does is he sets up this huge contrast between this rich man who had so much overflowing plenty and this poor beggar who's laying at his gate wishing to just receive the morsels that fell from his table. What a miserable life. Covered in sores and dogs licking his sores. And yet the fact is that the day came when they both died. It came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died, and he was buried, but he lifted his eyes up in hell. And being in torment, and seeing Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom, he cried and he said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou, when in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. Besides all this, between us and you, there's a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. You say, well, what does this story have to do with the importance of the Old Testament?